Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. When we were brainstorming about the different ways that we might celebrate the 150th anniversary of our parish, one of the early thoughts that we had was to have a history, both of the parish, but then as we thought about it, we thought it'd be good to have a history of the Archdiocese, because that's something that maybe a lot of people aren't very familiar with, and then in the context of that to have a presentation on the history of our parish. So I was very happy as I was meeting with our staff putting things together. The first person that I recommended was Father George Evans to be able to come and do this for us, and I was really delighted that he said hello. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Father Evans. Father Evans is a very proud son of Somerville, so he'll probably talk for like 40 minutes about Somerville. So and he went to Matignon High School, and from there to Boston College, and then to the Seminary, and he did his doctoral studies at Catholic University of America. He was ordained in 1977. And then he was a professor and spiritual director at St. John Seminary, and that's when I got to know him best. Father Evans and I very happily worked as colleagues there for a number of years. His specialty is in the area of history, but then especially the history of spirituality and of the saints. That's the main academic work that he's done. He's also been very involved in the Archdiocese in lay formation, teaching in any program that we've had here in Boston. Father Evans has taught in it, both for the diaconate and for our lay students. And he was also very helpful in taking a look at the different parishes and the ministries and how do we best move forward in the life of the Archdiocese. He did that for a number of years. He was the pastor at St. Julia in Weston, and now presently is the pastor at Holy Name in West Roxbury. Beautiful, beautiful church. So this is, again, part one of the talk, if you're able to come again next week. Next week we will be over in Di Giovanni Hall. We just had another event there today, so it was easier to do this here, but we'll do it in Di Giovanni Hall next week, and we'll look forward to seeing you and certainly invite folks as well. So thank you so much, Father Evans, for being here. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be back with my friend and colleague. We worked together for a lot of years at St. John's. So today we have a lightning look at the history of the Archdiocese of Boston. Almost an impossible task, but we're not going to go too deeply into it, but we'll be broad in our view. And it's going to be based mostly around the bishops. That's why the handout that you have on one side has the chief leaders of the Archdiocese before there were any bishops, and then when the bishops come in, we'll go bishop by bishop and look at the things that were happening around their times, and look at them too. So are you ready to start? There's an interesting period before we had Boston's own bishops. As you know, Boston was founded 1630. The Puritans came and they wanted to set up a city upon a hill. They thought that they had this theocracy, this government led by God, that would be astounding for the whole world, that the world would see what they're doing and flock to that idea. Well, it didn't quite work out that way, as most of our human endeavors don't, but they did have great power in Boston for a long time. So much so that in Boston, the Puritans held sway and the Catholics were not much to be found at all. In fact, there was the idea that if a priest came, and this was in the 1640s or so, if a priest were to come, especially a Jesuit who they didn't like, first thing would be he'd have to leave. If he was coming again and caught, he would be jailed, and then he'd have to leave. And if he came a third time, he would be hanged. Now, I don't think it was ever tested, because no one wanted to come. It was just off limits to Catholics. And so for that reason, our area of the country is not where you think of when you think of the beginnings of the church in the United States. You might think about the California missions and the Florida missions too, and the explorations, often with priests involved in the upper Midwest. You might think about Maryland, finally, and the Middle Atlantic states. They were more cordial to Catholics, though not greatly cordial. But Maryland was founded with a special concern for Catholics that kind of evaporated after a while. Anyhow, up here, New England was not Catholic land at all. So, there was really no, in the Boston area, no infiltration of Catholics or Catholic culture. There were missionaries in the northern part of New England who worked among the Indians, and some priests passed through there, and here and there was some ministry. As the Revolutionary War came along in the 1770s, things changed. We needed the help of France, and it was given. France was a Catholic country. And there were Catholics, not many, but they were as patriotic as anyone else, and so they lent their own bodies and their own efforts to the war effort. In fact, before the war, there had been the practice of something corresponding to Guy Fawkes Day over in England. It was Pope's Night here in Boston, and they would burn in effigy the Pope every year. In fact, they were continuing to do that during the Revolutionary War when George Washington basically said, "What are you doing? We have Catholics involved in this effort. Stop it." And then when the war was won, and when the American way of life started to take root, Catholics, as one of our storytellers of Boston's Catholic history says, Catholics sniffed the air, those who had come over as Catholics but had kind of drifted away because they didn't have much ministry available, much community available. Some of them had gone into other churches to be part of their life. Catholics started to sniff the air, and the air was a little more fragrant for Catholics. And so in the 1780s, partly because of trends in the country, but also because of this part of the world being part of the country and the memory of the war effort, Catholics banded together. In fact, one of the Yankee men who became one of the first priests in Boston showed himself in the 1780s. He went over to Europe to study. There he became convinced that Catholicism is the right way to go, and he switched from being a member of the Puritan tradition, which started to be called Congregationalism, and he became a Catholic over in Europe, and then studied to be a priest. And he sent the word over to Father Carroll, who was not yet Bishop Carroll, who would become the first bishop of Baltimore and of all of America. He sent the word over that he would be interested in serving his native area as a priest. And his name was John Thayer, and he was raring to go. That was part of his problem. Anyway, he got delayed for various reasons over in Europe. He was supposed to have been the first Boston priest resident. Well, it didn't quite happen that way. Before he could get back, in 1789, a priest came on a ship. His name was Bouchard, but he called himself the fancy term, the Abbé de la Poterie. And it was kind of a trumped up title and all that. And he came, and he really had good intentions of building a church. In fact, he rented a twice-abandoned Protestant church on School Street in Boston, across from the old Boston City Hall, the old Boston City Hall. And there's a plaque there now. And it said that this was where the Catholic Church began. He had a little relic of the Holy Cross, and he didn't have much more than that. He took that relic of the Holy Cross, and he said, let's call the Church of the Holy Cross. And so the little group gathered, and they were a ragtag group, mostly French, some Irish, some from different places, mostly poor people, but not all. Well, before too long, he racked up a lot of expenses that the community couldn't afford. Then it was found out he had been a suspended priest in France. So Bishop Carroll, who started right around the same time Pottery started in Boston, Carroll started as not just Father Carroll, but bishop for the country, rooted in Baltimore. He had to suspend him or tell him he was already suspended and you have to go. Well, before too long, they were hoping for this Father Thayer to come back, a native of the city, the town. Before that happened, Louis Rousselet, a second French priest, came. And he did his best, but his English wasn't too good, and they were striving for something more. Well, finally, this Father John Thayer, a Yankee convert, came to town, and he was quite self-assured. And he said, I speak good English, Rousselet does not. And he put pressure on Bishop Carroll to let Rousselet go. And there was this division into factions, and it went back and forth. In fact, Bishop Carroll had to come and visit. It was kind of a fact-finding mission, a division-solving mission, he hoped. But it had another advantage. It got the civic leaders in Boston to see Bishop Carroll and to be impressed by him, and he to be impressed by them. At their best, they got along quite well. So it was back and forth. There was the French mostly backing Father Rousselet, and the Irish mostly backing Boston-born convert Father Thayer. And it was not pretty. Finally, it was found out Father Rousselet was also a suspended priest from France. So, by default, Father Thayer won the battle, if you will. But when Bishop Carroll came to Boston, he had a lot of contacts back in England where he had studied, and he was writing to England, and he said this: in these circumstances, I am very sorry not to have here a clergyman of amiable, conciliating manners, as well as of real ability. Well, that was written back to the friends in England. Something else was happening over in England. The French Revolution had happened, think of 1789, and so priests, to save their hides and to be true to themselves, left France and went over largely to England. And when they were in England, there were really too many priests, mostly French, in a country that didn't need so many priests. And so they were hiring themselves out as tutors and things like that. And the greatest priests among them longed to do real priestly work. There was one priest, Father Francis Matignon, who had been a professor of scripture in a college over in Paris. And he went over to England. And somebody who knew him and knew Bishop Carroll linked them together. Somebody wrote a letter of recommendation, you might say, and said, I have met many priests who are émigré priests from France, but among them there has been no Matignon, as if to say he's the cream of the crop. So over he came to Baltimore, met with Bishop Carroll, and Bishop Carroll said, I'm sending you to Boston. And up he came in 1792. Rousselet was still in town, suspended though he was, and Thayer was still there. And once Thayer met Matignon, you'd think there was going to be crossfire, but Matignon's amiable, conciliating ways ended up having the two of them becoming friends. But there was not enough work or money to support two priests. Thayer got the idea and, with some prodding, moved on to the south and finally to Ireland. Before he left, he shared with Matignon his dream that there would be a Catholic school somewhere in the country, but preferably in Boston. So he left a little money and trusted it to Matignon for Catholic school to be here in Boston. So Matignon comes, and he ends up being capable and very easy to deal with, very much a consultative kind of person, and very much a man of manners. He was by no means a suspended priest like those other two Frenchmen. Before he was here too long, because he had obligations to serve all of New England, which means some outpost seacoast towns and the Indians and other settlers in Maine. He wrote to Father Chevreuse, who had been an acquaintance of his, not exactly his student, but an acquaintance of his over in England, and he too had left France. So John Chevreuse, a much younger priest, ended up coming to Boston, and with Bishop Carroll's permission, the two of them worked together for many years. They started to build up the church, but it was hard to do. The community was small. After a few years, the French were mostly gone, and the Irish ascended. This is around the turn of the 19th century. And they said, we really need a new church. This church we're renting is just a dump, you might say. They had brought it up to its best. But they said, let's have a building fund. Well, the building fund was up and down, and they stopped the building fund. Finally, to make a long story short, they got the property sold to them at a good price in what had been a former theater on what's now Franklin Street, and they were able to build a cathedral. But it wasn't a cathedral yet. It was a church, but it was later to become the cathedral. And it was only helped along because about a quarter of the money came from Protestant backers who came to be impressed with Matignon and Chevreuse. Chevreuse was more outgoing, had a better command of English, was younger, a little more energetic. But the two of them worked as a team. And in their work there, they were able to win over some people who were otherwise perhaps a little bit wary of these Catholics. And they built in 1803 a church. Bishop Carroll came for the second time, this time to bless it, much happier circumstances. And after the new church came, Protestants who would help the effort along, they came to church once in a while to listen, especially to Father Chevreuse, who was very eloquent. And the church grew and grew. But it was not easy because they were a distinct minority. Because they were a distinct minority, though, there was not really all that much worry of clashes. Another thing was happening during this time. In the Puritan tradition, exactly during the time of Matignon, which ended up being 1792 to 1818, the Puritan tradition was seeing a pendulum swing happen. They came from a tradition that was strongly Trinitarian, very much aware of the wrath of God and the depravity of human people, and they had a sense that God is our God and get involved in our church, and there was kind of a suspicion of anyone else, certainly Catholics. Well, during Matignon's time in Boston, things swung to what we now call Unitarianism. Not only that they didn't believe anymore in three persons in God, just God, but also a sense of the human capacity, not so much depravity, but the opportunities that humans had to do good things on their own, and an enlightenment view that said, wow, what reason can accomplish, you know? It brought with it a growing chasm between Catholics and themselves, but also a sense of tolerance. They were open, much more than the traditional Puritans had ever been, to other groups in the town. Now, they weren't exactly saying, hi, we're all in this together. There was still the class difference and all that. But there was this tolerance, and especially when they met people who were people of manners, like Chevreuse and Matignon, they welcomed them into their circles. Not in every way, perhaps, but in the way of socializing and working together on town projects. And Matignon and Chevreuse were in no way a threat. Well, Matignon died in 1818. Chevreuse was devastated, but stayed here 5 more years. He had been asked different times to go back to Europe, and he had resisted the call. But after Matignon died, 5 years later, he did go back in 1823. He died over a decade later as Cardinal Archbishop of Bordeaux. And his memory is long remembered, and so is Matignon's. Well, the diocese was so poor that they didn't get another bishop for 2 more years. In 1808, when Boston was established as its own diocese, Severus was chosen to be the bishop. And so he led for 15 years. But there were dioceses in New York and Philadelphia and Bardstown, Kentucky. The idea was, Boston is so poor, why don't we just make it part of the New York diocese? Nowadays, we Bostonians wouldn't want to hear that. It didn't happen, but they put in Father William Taylor, who had come to Boston to work with Severus for 2 years. He wasn't chosen to be the bishop, but there was a choice of a new bishop, and that was a bishop from in the southern part of the country, Benedict Fenwick. He came from a pretty prominent family from Maryland. He was a Jesuit, and he had been working in New York. He had been president of Georgetown College in D.C., and he had worked in South Carolina, where there were more Catholics than around here. So he came, and just before he came, the dream of Father Thayer to have a Catholic school had been reached. And Ursuline sisters, whom Thayer had met in Ireland, came over to Boston, and they set up a school in downtown Boston under still Bishop Severus at the time, and then Father Taylor's leadership. And that school ended up in 1826, right after Bishop Fenwick came, moving to Charlestown in what is now Somerville. I was going to mention Somerville, here it comes. In what is now, if you know where Assembly Square is, it's basically there. That was the nunnery grounds. And that school took a little turn. It was started as a school for the Catholic children, girls. But it became a school for rich young ladies, many of whom were Protestant. And there started to be, during the 1820s and 30s, more Irish immigrants. And so the good feeling era of Matignon and Severus pretty much got hurt a bit, and there was more tension, economic tension, a sense of rivalry from these Irish upstarts, you might say. Well, to make a long story short, one summer night in 1834, the Ursuline convent, built at a place called Mount Benedict over in Charlestown, built for the bishop's, named for the bishop's saint, patron saint, was burned. And the money was never recovered. There were never any, there's never any retribution gained. And many Catholics were devastated. Many Protestants were embarrassed and apologetic, others not so much. But Bishop Fenwick, who was absolutely overblown by that action, he rallied on. It was really tough being a bishop in those days. He was bishop from 1825 to 1846. And during that time, there was increased Irish immigration, not what it would be after his successor started. And Fenwick had the job of establishing the diocese more. He had a Catholic newspaper begun, which is still in operation, now called The Pilot. He started an orphan asylum, and he welcomed Mother Seton's sisters to come and staff it. He also had the idea, what can we do for our immigrants? And so up in Maine, in 1834, same year as the burning of the Ursuline convent, he had a utopian community, you might say, established out in the woods. It wasn't the perfect idea, but it was an honest effort to help people who mostly were from a rural place, to live in a rural place. It was called Benedicta, Maine. It's still there. And at the same time, there was rising tension between Irish Catholics and others. In 1837, there were the Broad Street riots. Broad Street is down in the financial district in Boston, a wide, broad street, and it was where most of the poor Irish lived. There were riots there, contentious relations that resulted in that. And there was a riot against the Irish Montgomery Guards, who were put in place to try to defend the Irish people. There were also tensions among the Catholics. The number of parishes in the diocese started to increase. In 1826, a new parish in Salem, then one in Lowell, then one in Charlestown in a 3-year period. And then in the outskirts a bit, Waltham and Worcester. And some of them had tremendous intramural tension. St. Mary's and Waltham. You could make a movie out of what happened out there in those early years, right around the end of Bishop Fenwick's time. Real disturbances. Benedict Fenwick was a man of letters, very cultured, very good pastor. He had a dream of educating people, and so he came up with the idea of a college. And they took the name of the church in Boston, which was in its second rendition, now a cathedral on Franklin Street, and they named the college after the cathedral, the College of the Holy Cross at Worcester, founded by Bishop Fenwick. He's buried out there, in fact. Hartford became a separate diocese for all of southern New England in 1844, so you can see the Catholics were growing. Bishop Fenwick died in 1846, right around the same time when the Irish potato famine happened. And the Protestant community of Boston didn't know what hit them. If there had been a steady stream of Irish immigrants between the end of Cheverus's time and during Fenwick's time, there was an absolute flood of Catholics during the time of the next bishop, who started in 1846, John Fitzpatrick. Boston-born, son of the cathedral parish. He was pretty young when he was made a bishop. He died after 20 years as bishop. He died right at the end of the Civil War in 1866. John Fitzpatrick was also a person who very much was a man of culture, and he very much prized his city, Boston, and he wanted very good relations between the Irish and the others. He was strongly Catholic. He would not in any way concede or give away Catholic beliefs or Catholic practices, but he was also very peace-seeking. And John Fitzpatrick came into Boston just as the Irish were flooding in. There were Irish Catholic crusades, anti-Catholic crusades that were developing around the country, and certainly in Boston too. At one point in 1847, the nativists, who were the ones who didn't have much openness to immigrants, they distributed handbills calling for an end of the Deer Island, now in Winthrop, hospital for immigrants. Catholic schools started to take root. The Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur came to Boston in 1849 and started teaching in the North End, and then they branched out to many other places. As they started to run schools, Protestant officials in the different municipalities would tend to send in inspections of the Catholic schools. What are they teaching them in these schools? And it usually worked out well, but it was a great insult in some ways to the sisters and to the Catholics. In 1850, a Protestant schoolmaster in Boston was tried in court for attacking a Catholic boy who refused to recite the Protestant version of the Ten Commandments, things like that. The diocese tended to split off, and Burlington and Portland, Maine, and with it New Hampshire, was made a separate diocese in 1853. So we were down to just Massachusetts by the 1850s. In 1860, it was decided that the cathedral on Franklin Street was sitting in the midst of an area that was no longer very residential, and it was too small. So it was closed. It was also raised, and they said, we want a new cathedral. Well, then comes the Civil War. So from 1860 to 1875, there was no cathedral, and the diocese used theaters and halls, and finally they got some property in the South End for the current cathedral. In 1861, I should say in this neighborhood, Harvard College granted an honorary doctorate to Bishop Fitzpatrick, largely in view of Catholic volunteers' efforts for the Civil War in their military service. And in the early 1860s, Catholics entered a new school, a college, which had a high school with it, run by the Jesuits, Boston College. So you could see the emergence of Catholics little by little. In 1866, after the war, came a new bishop. Like his predecessor, Fitzpatrick, the new bishop, John Williams, ended up being a man who was a native of the Cathedral Parish in Boston. And he was to serve the longest stint of any bishop in Boston, 41 years, 1866 to 1907. He was rather a laid-back man, laissez-faire. He saw the growth of the Catholic Church all through the Archdiocese. It was an Archdiocese after 1875, the year of the new cathedral, so he became Archbishop John Williams. He saw the coming together of people in the western part of the state for the Diocese of Springfield, which included what we now have as the Diocese of Worcester. So from 1870 on, he was dealing with just the confines of the current diocese, 5 East Commonwealth counties. In 1873 came the Sisters of St. Joseph to West Roxbury, and a few months later, the town of West Roxbury became part of the city of Boston, and they ended up opening many, many schools too, including one here at St. Paul's. And a new seminary was founded for Boston. It had been the dream for many years, and in 1884, they founded St. John's Seminary in Brighton. What was also happening was a real push in the Catholic Church of our country for Catholic schools. Interestingly, Archbishop Williams, like his predecessor Fitzpatrick, was not really, really big on Catholic schools. He thought if we send our Catholics to the public schools, they'll get along together. As long as it's not too much tension, they'll grow together, better relations all around, and that might be the better way. But he wasn't absolutely against Catholic schools. So in Boston, during the Williams era, there wasn't a great push for Catholic schools, but there were a good number. And there were still tensions. You know, I wonder if those Catholics are teaching the kids proselytizing, all that stuff. And so there were always inspections and criticism. But they came through it all. The Catholic Charitable Bureau was founded to deal with the many, many people in the Boston area who were poor. But Catholics were starting to take their place as people in civic government, and there were elected officials who were Catholic in the John Williams era. Williams' style of being bishop was laid back. He was kind of a decentralized organization. His was a decentralized organization, and there were people from not only Ireland, but Poland, and especially Italy after 1890, and many from French Canada, many from English-speaking Canada, a few from Lithuania and Portugal, not so much German in this part of the country. Williams stayed a long time as our bishop, but in 1907, he was quite old, and he had received a coadjutor bishop the year before, a native of Boston Diocese from the city of Lowell, William O'Connell. He was kind of a mover and a shaker, and he was rather a triumphalistic person, very much self-promoting, you would say, and he came from a background that would say, we can't be Roman enough. Archbishop Williams didn't have that outlook, but Archbishop O'Connell, who was made a cardinal 4 years after becoming Archbishop of Boston, pushed the connection with Rome. And he also portrayed himself as the super organizer of a rather disorganized diocese led by a very old bishop who had lost his energy. Well, some of that was true. Williams was pretty old, and O'Connell was raring to go. but O'Connell very much put Williams into the shadows. He purchased the Pilot, and it became the official organ of the Archdiocese. He established a lot more parishes. He came under some criticism nationally and internationally, and at one point he had appointed his nephew chancellor of the Archdiocese, even though the nephew was not really experienced or that capable or that full of good character. So it was real nepotism. And the man, it turns out, was involved in shady financial dealings and also secretly married. It came to the attention of the Pope, and the Pope called Cardinal O'Connell over to Rome, and Cardinal O'Connell came back disgraced in the eyes of Rome and not well liked by a lot of his fellow bishops. So he took out his desire to be dominant on a lot of the people in Boston, and he ended up being a very hard-working bishop on the one hand, but also one who was very much the power person in charge. And he kept a lot of people, the Sisters of St. Joseph, for example, and his priests and his seminarians, right under his thumb. At the same time, he's well known for speaking to the United States a message that says, the age of the Puritan has passed, the age of the Catholic has come. And so Catholics saw in him someone who was rather eloquent, fearless, and able to say, we are here, listen to us. He kind of fit the times, even though if you had to work with him, it was difficult. In those days, God and country, for God and country, was sometimes something you'd see on church buildings. There was such a link between God and country. And there was such a push for missionaries. In fact, Maryknoll was started with somebody who was from this parish, Father Walsh, who became Bishop Walsh. And there was, throughout the Archdiocese, a real sense of pride in our being Catholic. Now, Cardinal O'Connell had had a bad run-in with the Sulpician priests who ran a seminary he went to down in the Middle Atlantic. And when Archbishop Williams founded the seminary before O'Connell was the bishop, he invited the Sulpician priests. They were kind of specialists in seminary work to come and lead the seminary. Well, in 1911, just 4 years after O'Connell became the bishop, in the same year in which he became a cardinal, he expelled the Sulpician fathers. They had had a few Boston priests working as their colleagues on the faculty, and he expelled the Sulpician fathers, and the famous line is, you can go and take your dead with you. So they had to unearth the bodies and all that. O'Connell oversaw the establishment of the first women's Catholic college in New England, Emmanuel College, in 1919. Regis College came after it in 1927. And there was, throughout all of O'Connell's time, a real sense that the Catholic Church is kind of riding high. And with that came a certain, you might say, triumphalist feeling. Militant and Triumphant is the name of a biography written about Cardinal O'Connell. He finally died in 1944, and he was succeeded by by his only auxiliary bishop, who was Richard Cushing. Richard Cushing had been an auxiliary bishop for 5 years, and then in 1944, he succeeded as Archbishop of Boston. He stayed as Archbishop of Boston until 1970. And his style was also a rather political one, very much fundraising, not that he was ever using the money much for himself. He was always using it for building up the church, especially buildings, and giving money to missionaries all over the world. He didn't live a high lifestyle at all. O'Connell rather did, but Cushing did not. And he was very much a fundraiser and a fund giver. And his leadership style was different from O'Connell's. O'Connell's had a regal air, a kind of a distant managerial style. Cushing was eloquent in his own way. He had a very gravelly voice, and it was a famous voice at the time. And he was someone who was rather political in his style of doing things among his priests and all that, but a real evangelist, a real mission-minded person. And he had been the director of the Propagation of the Faith Society in Boston. When he came to town, he came with a lot of fresh ideas. He probably looked around the country and pulled the best from what he saw then. And he tapped people to give him ideas, and he had a lot of his own. He established a lot of new parishes out in the suburbs. Priests used to wait at least 26, 27 years to be pastors, and in 1945, a year after his becoming pastor, he made sure that all his classmates ordained in 1921, by 1946, their 25th anniversary, would be pastors. So he took a lot of these little missions that were kind of tied with some other local parish, and he made them separate parishes. And he established new parishes where there hadn't been any. And that kind of went along with the post-World War II boom, the movement to the suburbs, the decline of the city areas. And so he established many more parishes, expanded a lot of the schools. Little schools became bigger. By the way, at St. Paul's, it went the other way. A big school became smaller because neighborhood changes. More about that next week. He also established central high schools, one of them named for Father Matignon up the street here, another one named for Archbishop Williams, another one named for Bishop Fenwick, and so forth. An interesting thing happened, and more about it next week, but Father Leonard Feeney, right in this very neighborhood, broke off from the church, you might say, and during the 1940s there was tension. It's been said that Cardinal Cushing was made a cardinal only in the late 50s because of that Father Feeney controversy. But Cushing was so eager to serve. In 1945, he set up a separate parish just for black people. Kind of a controversial thing to do now that we look back, but it was an effort to evangelize. In the 1950s, a television and radio apostolate. Strong anti-communist feeling in the Archdiocese, and Fatima and its promises. He pushed that very much. He was very aware of the needs of the wider world, and the Pope had said, can we share our priests? So in the late 50s, he started the Society of St. James the Apostle, which would bring to Spanish-speaking parts of South America missionary priests who were diocesan priests who would volunteer just for a while to go down for a few years and serve in Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia. Many of them came in the beginning from Boston, but they came from other English-speaking parts of the world. The society still exists, much smaller. No Boston priests right now actively assigned to it, but it was quite the thing for a while. And by the end of Cardinal Cushing's time in 1970, the returning priests from the Society of St. James the Apostle ended up being, happily, a reservoir of priests who could be used to staff many of our Spanish-speaking churches who were providing a welcome and Mass in Spanish for people from many different places beyond just South America. But it worked out well. Cardinal Cushing was a friend to the Kennedy family. He was famously the one who gave the prayer at President Kennedy's inauguration in 1961 on that snowy day. He went to the Second Vatican Council, and he often said, I'm losing money every day that I'm at that council, because he wasn't able to fundraise. But he was also someone who backed the Declaration on Religious Liberty, and he did his part to advance the work of the council. He probably wasn't theologically astute or all that theologically interested compared to some of the bishops who were involved in the council. But he was a pretty typical American bishop. They say that bishops in the 1950s and 60s were brick and mortar bishops. If you look at any diocesan newspaper, including the Pilot, from that time, you'd see many pictures every week of Cardinal Cushing blessing a cornerstone, or opening a new school, or a new novitiate, or bringing another religious order into the diocese, and very often practically giving them a beautiful building for which they could, from which they could go out and do their work. He cared a lot for exceptional children, St. Coletta's in Hanover. He built a seminary for delayed vocations, as they called it back in 1964. And he got very involved in the civil rights movement, and he stood up for what was right and good. In the 1960s, Cardinal Cushing was getting older and sickly, and he had overspent, to put it frankly. He had not taken in as much money as he had given out. In the 1960s, he was greatly in debt, and the debt was getting worse and worse. By the time he died in 1970, he had come up with a Jubilee Fund idea to help to pay, but it didn't pay everything. He died in 1970, 2 months after being replaced by a bishop who was kind of a startling choice for Catholic Irish Boston. Umberto Medeiros came, a native of the Azores, a priest of Fall River, who had been chosen to become Bishop of Brownsville, Texas, and had worked with the poor down there. And Umberto Medeiros came, and the big challenge that faced him wasn't just that he was from another culture, but it was the diocese was badly in debt. And so little by little by little, he worked like a dog, it's been said, to get the diocese in good financial shape. And that was kind of a behind-the-scenes, unglamorous thing that he successfully carried out. He was a person of great kindness, great warmth, not the most decisive person, I think you'd say, and probably somebody who was almost too gentle for the job in some cases. He had a great sense of mission, a great sense of theology. He was a theologian. He had a great way with words. He was wonderful at languages, that kind of intelligence. Maybe not as much the street smarts that Cardinal Cushing had had. He found it very hard to correct priests. He had such a respect for priesthood and for priests. If you went to him with a problem, you'd find him hand-wringing with you. And sometimes he felt overwhelmed by his job. He was self-effacing, and he was somebody who, as much as possible, tried to reach out to the poor. He wrote a little encyclical called Man's Cities and God's Poor. And he tried to implement Second Vatican Council. In Boston, there had been awful segregation of the public schools during the 50s and 60s. And when he came in 1970, not long after that, of course, came the busing controversy. It was an imperfect way of trying to bring integration and equity to the Boston public schools. No matter who would have been bishop, it would have been a hard thing to deal with. He said some statements about the people of South Boston and so forth that got him in hot water. And he was just trying to do his best in a kind of a no-win situation, and always calling for respect for all people. He was involved in 1978 in the Covenant for Justice and Equality and Harmony, and he began various offices to reach out for better housing. I can remember he was part of an effort to take some unused convents or schools and to retool them to become housing for poor people. And what he said was very crucial. He said, I don't expect that this development here and that development there is making a huge difference. But I do it in a way to send the message that this is the kind of thing we should be doing, and others can do it in their own way. But we have to change the situation where the poor are being alienated. I want to do something on behalf of the institutional church locally to reach out for some fairness. And so the still existing Office of Urban Affairs for building and retooling buildings was instituted. During his time came the visit of the Pope to Boston in 1979. Cardinal Medeiros had a heart condition, and after 13 years as bishop, he went in for some heart surgery, which first was thought to be successful. And then on one Saturday morning, after it had come on the news that he was doing well and recuperating, he died at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, and there was a shock to the system of Boston. It was interesting. Something that happened right after he died says a lot about what was happening while he was bishop. He never was accepted by a bunch of people, a lot of people, because he was so different from what Boston was used to. But when he died, his body was laid out in 1983 in the fall at the Cathedral of the Holy Cross in the South End. And the number of people who came to his funeral was streaming and streaming and streaming some more. And it was a testimony to his having had something, a sense of the common person, a sense of love and peace and kindness and warmth, a real sense of Jesus. And the people really showed that more after he died than sometimes while he was alive. His successor came in early 1984. He was not from this part of the country, except he had been a student at Harvard and a graduate of Harvard, and he owed a lot of his vocation to what had happened right here in this parish and in this area. Cardinal Bernard Law came in 1984. He was to be bishop until 2002. And he had a great sense of the mission of the church, and he really wanted to get everyone organized for mission. Parish pastoral councils, parish finance councils, workshops of all kinds. Great attention to his priests. And if a priest was in the hospital, if a priest lost a loved one, he was right there. He was indefatigable in service of priests and people, and he wanted so much for Boston to thrive. He trusted his priest, he boasted of his priest, and he boasted of the diocese. He probably didn't want to see the diocese's bad side showed up in any way, and so you know what this is leading to. There came the clergy abuse crisis, which really was not just from his time, it was from before him. It was systemic. But he was, you might say, the poster child for it in some very, very sad cases of recidivist clergy sexual abuse. He did not do what he should have done. And he was not the only one, but he took the comeuppance for, really in some ways, for a lot more than just himself. And so with gratitude to him for all he had done to build up our diocese, there was kind of a sad but inevitable farewell, it's time to go, that was said to him back when he left. And he was succeeded by Cardinal O'Malley, who came in 2003 and just ended his stay as our bishop. And Cardinal O'Malley is especially noted for, as you know, you could say this as well as I, his efforts to bring harmony and healing as much as possible to those who had been abused. Cardinal O'Malley was especially important for our diocese on the mega scene, you might say, all the things that were making the news. And with his steady, calm, but dogged approach to seeking what's right, he brought about a lot of good. I think you would agree. He also kept the diocese going and had to reconfigure a lot of the diocese. In Cardinal Law's time, you might say the easiest, smallest parishes were closed. Never a happy thing, no matter how small the parish might be. But when Cardinal O'Malley came, he had to close parishes, and who's to say what parish it should be? So there was a tough reconfiguration system that went into place, and many of us remember it. And he had to come up with some places that were closed, and created a real shadow, you might say, over his time as our bishop. But he was trying to do his best to come up and deal with that. So, now I come up to Archbishop Henning, and he has just started, so I don't have too much to say. But yesterday I was at a meeting, and he called us to order at the meeting, and I have to say, I didn't recognize the voice. That's how little I know of him. And then I turned around, and I said, oh, that's what he sounds like, sure. I had seen him at his installation and all that. So anyway, look at my list here, if you got the handout, of all the bishops whom we've had, or all the leaders whom we've had. That's my attempt to bring them down to one fell swoop. Next week, the effort would be different. We'd look at Cambridge and St. Paul Parish especially. And let me just give you a little hint, and I think some of you know it well. What an outstanding and unique parish you have historically and currently, but wow, what a history. And a wonderful parish history was written back in the early 1990s. And so that's a wonderful resource for somebody like myself. But I also have looked at some other things and the diocesan history and so forth. Before I end, let me just say, what were the sources I used for today? Well, there were two. First of all, written in 1944 by a former Harvard professor, Robert Lord, and his two colleagues, John Sexton and Edward Harrington, The History of the Archdiocese of Boston, in 3 volumes. I only brought 1 volume. This is volume 2 out of 3. You can look at it if you want. And it's very detailed, and it's older history, but it's good history, well written. And then Professor Thomas O'Connor, late of Boston College, many years ago, made it easy for somebody like me or you who would read about it with this book, Boston Catholics, A History of the Church and Its People. It uses newer historical approaches, and it glides over some of the things that are in almost too much detail sometimes in this book. But put the two together, and you've got a lot to dig into. When I taught a course on the history of the Archdiocese at the Seminary, I said it's the easiest course I ever taught. If it hadn't been for this book being written, it wouldn't have been. But this book kind of framed the course, and then people would do individual reports taken from this book and some other sources. So I'll put these up here if you want to look at them. And I thank you for listening. It was an awful lot in one swoop, but at least we covered the high points. And hopefully see you next week. Thank you.